Well, I am, I was going to say honoured, or I actually had chuffed in my mind, which is no word, but I'm chuffed to be here. So thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak. As Kerry indicated, yes, I've flown down from Queensland, but I think I'm legit to be here because I am born and bred in Victoria, and as Kerry said, actually an alumnus. I think that's the right Latin singular of the University of Melbourne. And I still barrack for an AFL team, albeit a bad one at the moment, Carlton. We're in the right precinct, anyway, yes.
Make it a matter of prayer.
Absolutely. So as Kerry said, look, my day job is a role that I've been in for Churches Across in Queensland since the start of 2010. And I sort of marvel, really, the years go by. So it's 6 years, really now. Churches of Christ in Queensland is one of Australia's largest not-for-profits in the community services space. We provide seniors care of whole spectrum. We provide child, youth and family support services. We provide social and affordable housing. We provide support for the homeless and a whole range of other services, men's sheds and opportunity shops, etc. I'm also the head of the church, which I find quite amazing given my life journey, but nonetheless that's part of that goes with the role. And for those of you that don't know, Churches of Christ is a mainline Protestant denomination, and we'd sit probably very comfortably with the Baptists in the Uniting Church in terms of our theological sort of spectrum, if you like. Religion and the church are things that everyone tends to have pretty strong views about, both good and bad. And of course there's always the question of whether God exists anyway. It's many years since my 3 children were at kindergarten, but there was a time when the children were doing drawing lessons and the teacher was walking around encouraging the children, and she came up and she was looking at one little girl's drawing and she said, what are you drawing? And she said, I'm drawing God. And the teacher said, well, nobody knows what God looks like. And the little girl said, well, I will in a minute. And even amongst us who believe in God, there are, of course, old and ancient arguments about what the correct interpretations are and what the true translations of the passages in the Bible and theological understandings and what have you. And I need to say there's plenty of those that exist within our movement and what have you. In the same kindergarten, it was Christmas time and nativity play, and they were doing a reenactment of the birth of Jesus and the 3 wise men. And 3 little boys had been rehearsing about to fulfil the role of the 3 wise men, about bringing the gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh to the baby Jesus. I think most people would know the story. So the first one came out with a tea towel on his head, and he said, I bring you gold. And we put the box down. And then the second one was supposed to be frankincense, but they got confused and out of sequence, and the boy who was meant to be third, he sort of went forward, and he said, I bring you myrrh. And he put the box down. Now the little boy who was second was been really rattled about this because it's just thrown everything out. And so he now sort of comes on and, with the box, and he sort of forgot his lines, and he said, he blurted out, Frank said this. So there's confusion sometimes. So I want to tell you about some of the first months in my role as CEO, and as Kerry indicated, I moved up from Melbourne, and I knew very little about Brisbane. I'd been there to visit, and I think I'd been to Port Douglas for a week or something like that, but it was really going to a new thing, and I can remember the second day of the job, I got a call from the leader of the opposition, and that threw me straight away because I thought, oh, the leader of the opposition. And I hadn't done my homework properly. I learned who the relevant ministers were, but I hadn't learned who the opposition was. Anyway, he introduced himself and he started and he said, he said, we've got real problems with your housing development on the Gold Coast. And this is the second day, and I'm thinking, I knew where the Gold Coast was, but I didn't know about housing developments or whatever we had. So I said to him, John was his name, I said, John, look, my second day of my job, I've just come from Melbourne, and I said, look, I'm just going to write all this down and I'll get back to you about it. So he understood. But, so I decided I've got to get straight away, as soon as I can, get out and get across all of this. And as Kerry said, back then we had 100 and something. We've grown very significantly over the last 6 years, but there was still a lot of locations. So I travelled around, and it was really just listening. And as indicated in the intro, I took on the job, and it was said, look, we've got a lot of good things going with us, but it was frankly, it was in a bit of a mess, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the role of the job was the board. Basically, my writing instructions was to, can you bring back the mission of the organisation? Can you see if you can unite the organisations, because it's just totally fragmented and siloed all over the place, and rebuild confidence, and go forward. So they were the sort of writing instructions that I had. And I had a good board, so I had total backing at the time to sort of go forward. So I travelled around the state, and I spent the first 6 to 12 months just travelling, and particularly the first 6 months, and visiting, site after site. And I want to tell you about what came out of that listening. What emerged was 2 stories about the identity of Churches of Christ. And so I'll tell you about the first story, which was on the website and in the brochures, and I heard it when I was travelling around. And when I was talking to church leaders and other leaders in our care services and what have you. And the story was that Churches of Christ in Queensland at that stage was made up of 70 local churches, and we had various properties, we had various care services, all siloed. So we had aged care services that just operated in their community, and they had different logos and different names and what have you, and really disconnected from the church. And if you talk to the church leaders, there was a view that a lot of the people leading our care services now were not Christians, and in fact were anti-church, and that the whole thing had just gone sort of thing. The church itself, when you listened, there was this underlying current that people weren't really saying, but it was there, that we're dying. Half of our congregations are dying. They're ageing. The numbers are just going down and down. It was doom and gloom. We're dying. And I want to show you a couple of slides to give context to that. This was from research that's come from a number of sources, but essentially over the last 40 years, Christianity in Australia has dropped by 22%. That's people saying or identifying with Christianity. Church attendance has dropped by 48%, and no religion, both in Australia, UK, US and Europe, is just escalating through the roof. The other slide, which is of relevance, the trend line of declining engagement of Australians with the church. At the 2011 census, 61% of people ticked the Christian box, if you like to say I'm a Christian. Today, if you from again number of reputable studies that have been done around Australia, this was last year, about 15% of Australians attend church at least once a month. But on any given Sunday, about 8% of the population are sitting in a pew, if I can say it like that. So you've got 8% of the population. By definition, on any Sunday, 92% of the population are not in a church. So the story that we are dying and the church is dying and Christendom is dying is in fact could be said to be a true story. There are the stats. The other interesting one that I thought I'll just show, this was a study done by McCrindle in 2014, which I found quite fascinating, and it was a study across Australia asking people what are the most important things that you see that we need in our community, in our local community. And number one was parkland with walking tracks, free car park for public transport, community centre, and you can see. Now, It actually went down to about 25. I've ruled it off because of the topic that I'm talking about. The local church came in at number 13, which is good news in a way. It's still on the list. But as I've said in several other forums, people actually value leash-free dog parks more than the local church in their church, which is a sobering sort of thing. Now, this was no preconceived thing. It was just going out asking people, Cole, what would you most value in your community? So the story that the church is dying is a true story. It's losing relevance. It's losing attendances and what have you. So the story that I heard was the church is dying, Christendom is dying, and we are dying because our congregational members are going down. But I want to tell you about a second story that I also heard. And I'll say up front, this is a true story too, about the identity of churches of Christ. And this came from, as I travelled around, I made a point of trying to talk to community leaders. So where I would go out, and Queensland is vast. Coming from Victoria, you don't really understand. Like I've looked at maps and you sort of think, oh yeah, they're distances, but if you get in a car and you drive and you drive and you drive, it's about 12, 13 hours to Longreach, which is in the centre, and that's where the Qantas Museum is and what have you. 13 hours in a car, not stopping, so you stop. It's a long haul to get out there. And that's still right in the middle of Queensland, so it gives you some sense of it. So I travelled around in the car and visited people, and I want to tell you quickly about one particular one which was formative to me, and I visited Cunnamulla. Now, Cunnamulla, as you can see from the picture there, 1,200 k's from Melbourne, 1,000 from Sydney and 800 from Brisbane. So it's about a 9-hour drive, almost directly west, and it's red earth. It's not red there, it's got grass there, but when you're driving it's red earth, and it's flat, and it's right out in the outback. So I'd organised out of Cunnamulla, we Churches of Christ provide the only childcare services for the region, for the Shire, and we provide the only aged care services from the Shire, and it's subsidised. We don't make any money out of it, but we liaise with the council and with the Shire and make it work. So we're it when you go out there. Now, first time I travelled out there, I'd organised to meet the Mayor of the Shire and also the CEO of the council, and I found out when I got there that the Mayor was a lady and the CEO was a guy. They both had their children in our childcare centre, so I thought, this is interesting. And I subsequently found out that the Shire Mayor, her mum was in our aged care service, so it was really, because it's a small community, of course. But I thought, they absolutely have a feel for how our services are. But anyway, when I got there, first time travelling, and this, again, boy from Melbourne going out there, and I got there and they welcomed me into their boardroom, and they had the best crockery, and they had scones, and they had jam and cream, and it was like, I thought, this was, really felt royalty sort of coming in here. And we were chatting and talking, and they said, we are so pleased with what the church does in our community. And the penny dropped with me. I thought, that's really interesting, because back in Kenmore, which is where our head office is, and where a lot of the wars were playing themselves out, those childcare centre and the aged care centre were designated as care services. Because actually in Cunnamulla we don't have a local church congregation. We actually have that. And yet I got the CEO and the Mayor of the Shire of Cunnamulla saying we so appreciate what the church is doing in our community. And I thought, that's really interesting. They clearly see this as the church, using that language. In our you go back there, it's like, no, that's not the church. So, and this happened in a number of communities when I was travelling around. So what I found out, and I'll tell you one other quick story, which further dropped the penny for me as I was travelling around. I went up to Charters Towers, so I'm jumping around the state of Queensland, but Charters Towers, for Victorians that may not know the geography, if you go up to Townsville, it's just as far as coming down to Melbourne, so that'll give you some idea of the distance. You get in a plane, you go to Townsville. It's just about an hour, 45 minutes to fly up there. And then Charters Towers is an hour's drive west. It used to be a gold mining town. They used to have their own stock exchange. See, a bit of trivia there, I found out. But anyway, so I travel out to Charters Towers, and I should say, in our system, when I got there, we've now changed it a few years ago, but when I got there, you have one register for all the churches, and then you had another register for all the care services, and they had sub-registers for aged care or housing or childcare centres or whatever, and all of those operated as silos with different heads or what have you. But anyway, this was one of our so-called 70 churches, Charters Towers Churches of Christ, Church of Christ. So I found my way there, and anyway, they don't meet in the church anymore. It was a traditional out in the paddock brick church, with that and the cross and all of that. But that was all falling down. So what now consisted of the Church of Christ in Charters Towers now consisted of 9 people, all I met them, probably at least 70, probably 80, and what have you, and they met in each other's homes. It was actually 4 families that had been together all over the years and had dwindled, and they met faithfully every Sunday, and I joined them for a Sunday lunch, which ironically again it was so hot, and we go in, there's no air conditioning, and they had a roast lunch, and I'm thinking, wow. It was just this sort of cultural sort of things that you go through. Anyway, so we had a lovely roast lunch, stinking heat, and with this lovely group of family, and we had a prayer, and we had communion, and we had a prayer, and we had lunch, and then we went, and great fellowship. And I've said in other forums, look, I have no issue about 2 or more gathered in Jesus' name, I'm there, he said. So that's fine, that's a gathering. But that is listed on our register of the Charters Towers Church of Christ. I then, in the same week, travelled down, because I was travelling down the coast, I went to Maryborough. Maryborough in Queensland's about mid, it's come down lower mid-coast of the thing, and we've got a big aged care centre service there. And the main one in the community. And anyway, I went there to, in the role I was in, to hand out certificates for volunteers. We were having a recognition of volunteers, and there were 80 volunteers that volunteered at Maryborough, aged care service. There was 120 odd residents and staff and what have you. Anyway, so I get there, and they've got this luncheon on, and the mayor was there, and they got balloons, and people had come in with their families, and there were hundreds of people, and bursting with life. And then they had a church service on, and there were again hundreds of people there, and we had a lady on an organ, and they played the old-fashioned hymns, belting them out on the organ, and then we had a retired minister who preached out a grand sermon, and it very much looked like a Church of Christ service straight out of the 1960s, which was exactly what it should have been, because a lot of the people were there. It was full of life. And in our system, though, that's not a church. That's a care service, or it was. So I had this conversation at our council meeting and in AGM, and I said, look, I was talking about all this, and I'll come back to it in a minute, but I said, what criteria are we using ourselves to define what goes on this register as a church and this register as a care service that in our mythology is, they're not part of the church, they're all not it. I said, if you go to Charters Towers, and I'm not debating the Charters Towers definition, but I said we've got a group of 9 people who come together once on Sunday to have a lunch, and they have a prayer, they have communion, they have a prayer, and then they go home. That's it. Okay? So there's no sermon, there's no songs. I'm not saying there has to be, but what criteria are we using? I go to Maryborough, bursting with life, contributing massively to the life and uplift of that community. We they in fact have 2 church services. They have one, I found out, one on Wednesdays, and they have one on Sunday mornings, and they have 4 hymns, and they have communion, and they have a sermon, and they care for each other. And they're actually meeting in their own home too, because an aged care service is their home. So I said, what criteria are we using to define what is a church, and what does it mean to be the people of God in a community? So we went on this journey of confronting the two stories, both of which are true. Churches of Christ in Queensland, we can say, it's a true story, is dying. 70 churches, Christendom is dying, here's all the stats. Or the second story is Church of Christ in Queensland actually has over 200 locations that we're making a huge difference to people's lives in those communities. We're bringing uplift, we're bringing life, we're bringing meaning, we're bringing a sense of purpose, we're bringing love into the community. We're actually highly regarded by both state government and local government, who say we really, really value what you're doing in the community. And that's a true story too, because I can give you evidence for that. So I went to our first AGM conference, which is a big gathering. I don't know people's background, but often a different denomination will call it synod or gathering. So we went that. We have that annually. And I talked about these two stories, and I said, look, it's really just a matter of choice. Which story do we want to live in? I said, I've heard people say there are no young people coming, going into our theological colleges anymore. We've got where are all the young leaders coming from? And I said, I see a lot of young leaders actually working out in areas that are not the mainline church, but are out here. And I said, if we want to live in the first story, I said, I've got 3 kids who are all grown up who are really passionate about causes and what have you, but I can tell you they do not want to go to a church in the first system, because they don't, But they're actually very, I speak highly of my 3 children. So I said, where are the young leaders? Well, we're not attracting any young leaders if you're living in the first story, because no one wants to be associated with that. I said, I don't want to be associated with it, because it's a dying story. But if we live in the second story, it's just a matter of choice, then let's maximise that, and let's work out what does that mean. So that went across very well, really well. Because the mindset was, it was largely unfrozen, because I think, as you said, it was there was, at the point the year before I went up there, a number of our larger churches had actually met privately about just withdrawing, just they were going to leave the conference, which would have just collapsed the whole thing. So we had 2 stories that were true. And there was a decision collectively and unanimously, or overwhelmingly anyway, to say, yes, let us go forward with the second story. So having gotten to that point, it was then, okay, well, what do we need to do to actually forward that? It's fine to say that, because everyone, I want to be on the positive side of the ledger. How did we do it? Now, I could talk for a long time, but I want to just give some highlights. I wanted to just touch on that, and I would say most people in the room would be aware, and there are different slides, but this is a relevant slide in terms of the role of the church, I think, currently and going forward over the next decade or 2. We in Australia are an ageing population, and we've got massive issues that are coming forward. They're with us now, but they're just going to keep escalating. The one on the left, as you can see, is a few years old now, but it's from the Bureau government's website. Spending on per 5-year category, and as we know, costs of aged care, the age pension, health, etc., just escalate as we get older. The other correlated thing which is causing the whole social issues and policy issues at a national level is the projected ageing of the population, which, if you can make sense of that, is the black inner one is 1997, and the projection is out to 2051, which is showing more and more older people off the same base of younger people. So what that translates into, in simple terms, is that as we are going forward, we're getting proportionately fewer taxpayers being required to pay more and more to support an ageing population, which is health costs essentially and pension costs. So we've got, as I said, we're on the front end of it because of the baby boomers, of which I'm a part of, and going forward, what it means is that actuarially it doesn't add up, and so we're seeing a whole range of policies looking for extend the retirement age, try and keep people working longer. Can you get co-payments for care? Can you shift more and more out to the private sector? There's a whole range that I could go into on that. So It's relevant for the church because what the church has traditionally, at its best, looked after the poor. Now, as I said, there's a whole lot of stuff you could say around to that, but I would argue that certainly in our case, we take anyone who comes, but we do look after the sort of mid to lower end of the socio-economic range in our facility. If you talk about child, youth and family services, we're dealing with fractured people. We would have today certainly over 3,000 kids right today that we are looking after on behalf of the state that have been withdrawn from home or are orphans or whatever. And we're only one provider. That's in Queensland. So. The classic scriptural things of, pure religion is looking after the widows and orphans. I would argue that we do a lot of that. The aged care bubble is going to mean there's going to be more and more poor old people as we go forward. And as I've jokingly said in other forums, keep up your superannuation if you're younger, because you're going to need it. So I think the church has a role to play. Because of time, I could talk for ages about all of these, but I did want to put up to give some snapshot of some of the things that we have done over the last 5 years or so, and just touch on them. So these are some of the strategies of going forward to address living in the second story, particularly in the ageing population and the increase. I am arguing that I think we will see a greater increase of poor in Australia as we're going forward. We've really lived off the back of the resources boom nationally for the last couple of decades, and as we all know, that's now coming down. Be interesting to see, what can be put, whether we can get some of the projects back on board. But of course, there's environmental issues and there's a whole host of difficult issues that are going forward. But certainly in Queensland and WA have really majored on the resources booms, and we're just starting to see it. We've got Labor governments certainly Labor government in Queensland, and I'm not being political here, but they got into government about not transferring assets, not going ahead with any of the major projects that the previous government were going to do. Now what's happening is unemployment is starting to escalate. I was saying to a couple of people before Christmas, I was out at Chinchilla, which is again west, and if you go out west, it's where all the gas seam stuff is done, and we've had whole towns built on that where people were. You had speculators building houses, charging exorbitant rents. They were charging, $1,000 a week, to live in these, and because of the money that was flowing, people could support it. Well, it's all collapsed. I drove down street after street. This is in Chilla, and I could have gone out to Roma, or I could have gone out further out. It's a whole host of towns in the Surat Basin up there, and they were just vacant houses. You could buy them for $100,000. These are homes that down here would be, depends on your suburb, but would be $700,000 or $800,000. But of course, who's going to live there? They're vacant. It's vacant. It's a very real problem. Anyway, some of the strategies coming back to the topic that I was talking about, remissionalising the church. Some of the basic ones was that we had to take time and get all the stakeholders involved. Previously, when I started there, we had three. It sounds stupid, but we had three boards and three executive directors. Of different parts of the organisation. We had the church side, the sort of ministry side, clerical, theological side. We had all of the caring services side, and then we had all the property side. And each of them had boards, and they had executive directors, and of course they're all at war with each other. And they've been going on for about a decade or more. So we had to go through a whole lot of processes and ended up with, look, this is stupid. If you're a BHP or if you're any other normal organisation, you would have one leadership team with one coherent strategy, with one purpose and one working through. You can have sub-entities for sure, but we need to have proper governance structures. So we got there. So we've got one board, one leader, one executive team. We did a big listening and connect tour, which was about healing and unfreezing. So we, as I said, I'd already done that to a degree in the first 6 months or so just visiting, but now with the new board we got out and we had regional meetings and just listened and rebuilding trust really. We moved towards, said look, can we get, is there something that we could get everybody to put their hand up for, to say, look, I'm in favour of that, I can put my hand up for that. And was trying to get towards this one mission. And so whether you were an aged care service or a childcare service or a local church or a men's shed or whatever, could we find something that we could all agree on? And so what came out of that, we took away about the top 70 stakeholders in the state, all the power brokers, which was good going just to get all them in a room. And we had 3 days together. And what came out of that was agreement that we would have one mission statement to bring the light of Christ into communities, which for us, that was quite profound. And let me say why, because you might look at that and say, well, okay, that's fine. But actually, those words were quite profound, because the precursor to this was, I talked about listening when we go around, and when you listen to what people were on about, every area was about just growing their own services. So if I talk to the heads of the residential aged care, it was about, well, we want to get more aged care places. We want to get another facility in this community. Childcare, yeah, we want more childcare places. We want to get more childcare centres. So they've got their strategies of that. Housing, need more housing places. The homeless list, 30,000 on the homeless list in Queensland. We need more housing places. Talk to the church guys. We've got to plant more churches. We're dying. We've got to get more churches out there. And in crude terms, we want more bums on pews on Sunday morning. Look at the stats; they're all dwindling attendances. Everyone was about numbers, about growing. And I said, look, when I go around, I get that. I absolutely get that. But I said, when you talk to community leaders, none of them are saying that. What they're actually asking for is, we really appreciate the difference that you're making in our community. So they're community leaders, and in fact, we should be if we're major players in the community. And when I went round, a number of the communities, particularly Outback, we're the largest employer in that community. Because if we're running the aged care service and the childcare service, we're actually the largest employer. So it's like, we're major community leaders ourselves. Do we think that? Were we thinking that way? No. We had individual areas wanting to sort of get more places. So those words were, put the community in the centre. Put this child or this homeless person or this family or this community in the centre and say, what would it look like to actually make a difference to that? Because ultimately, Christianity, and I've argued, that it is essentially about transforming lives. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But at its best, that's what it does. That's what the purpose was, that what Jesus was on about, was about transforming lives, bringing more uplift to people. Through whatever lens. So it was like, do you need 5 minutes? Physical healing, mental healing, emotional healing, spiritual healing, whatever you need. So we went through all of that, and we came up with, put the communities in the centre. So we talked about one body then working together to forward the mission in each community. So it was, if we've got a childcare centre and a local church and an aged care, how can they all work together with community leaders to make a difference? So it was using all their assets then, instead of having segmented assets, a holistic view of the church, which I've touched on. The church at its worst, I reckon, is where it's trying to advance some dogmatic truth and, saying to people, open your head and I'm going to get it into your head, and then somehow you'll all be saved. You can hear in my tone, I react to that. Again, quick story, and I know time's running up, but the story's influenced me. I was meeting with, I met with one of our churches in the early days. It stays in my mind. I was getting people excited about the fact that, I said, do you realise this was in up at Caloundra, which is a bit north of Brisbane, great retirement area. And we were talking to the church there, and we've got a big strong church, probably 300 plus there, and I was talking to the leaders and getting them a bit excited about it. And I said, look, do you realise we've got a housing development just down the road? I think there's 120 units there with people, affordable social housing that live there. And I said, it'd be great if we could sort of, connect a little bit more, And one of the guys there said, I know what we'll do. He said, we could get tracts, scriptural verses, and put them on, type them on paper, and we could put them under the doors of all of the people. And he was saying this seriously. I mean, you laugh because I was trying not to laugh. And I was thinking, well, that'll do it, you know. I said, well, look, okay, you try to be positive. I said, what about, could I offer an alternative? What about we put on a barbecue and we actually invite them to come and maybe we could sort of relate to them a bit more, you know? Shuffling around with that because we don't actually meet the people, you know. You know, there's hundreds of those sort of stories. A holistic view of the church. The church is fundamentally about love and integrating faith and works. And I mentioned before, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual in an integrated way. Too often we hive off the spiritual and say, you do the spiritual bit, and then you guys do the care bit, or you guys do the education bit. Bring them all together. The other core pieces of this, our strategies were we set up strategic action leadership groups, or learning groups. And a bit of my background as an organisational psychologist was action learning groups and built around the work of Reg Revens. If you're interested, a great guy of last century who did some marvellous work in Britain during the war and post-war hospital system. So we set up strategic action leadership groups in regions of people that were passionate about working on this. What would it look like to have more of the light of Christ shining in communities? The first one we did was up at Nambour, which is on the coast, north coast, and we got 3 good churches up there. We had some strong care services, and I got the leaders together. I mean, it was about 10 of us, and put this question. I said, look, not asking you how are you going to run your churches more. We'll work with you as conference if we can. But would you be up for an ongoing conversation of what would it look like to have more of the light of Christ shining when the sunshine goes? What are the issues, you know, that? So I said, yeah, we're up for that. So then we went on a journey. Well, what are the areas of need on the Sunshine Coast? Got all these leaders, and of course, because of the mindset about growing your own service, it was sort of like a bit of a blank. I don't really know well, let's talk to community leaders. Let's talk to, do some research. So what came out? Sunshine Coast, one of the biggest issues was suicide, men's suicide and men's health. It's, Sunshine Coast tends to high retirement, I think, because of the weather. A lot of Victorians go up there. And that was news to me. You know, Sunshine Coast is, up and about, but there's this black, hidden shadow side of it. You know, men suiciding and what have you. And if you go a little bit to the west, off the land, there was a lot of issues with that. So it was like, well, what can we do about that? You know, and someone came up with the idea, well, what about a men's shed movement? Okay. So one thing led to another. And this was a challenge because it's like it doesn't fit into aged care or child care or whatever. But if you're putting up your hand and going around the place saying, we're on about bringing the light of Christ into communities, well, it doesn't always fit into your nice boxes. You'll get answers that you have to reinvent yourself. So we started on this journey of reinventing and saying, well, on that. So the Nambour one was a ripper because we had a block of land beside a retirement village that we bought for a future building, but we thought we could put a men's shed on that. Someone knew someone worked at Shell, and Shell, we had the big floods up there. You may remember going back 2010, 11, 12, we had floods, massive floods up there. Anyway, they had a big shed that they'd written off. They said, we'll give it to you, if you can use it. It's a beauty. And Bunnings got on board, and before you knew it, we had this brand men's shed. It was fitted out with equipment and what have you. We had guys from the churches coming, we had guys from the retirement thing. We put on a show, at the Nambour show, a tent, with some of the works and that. People could sign up to join up. The Nambour show, over 300 men signed to join the men's shed. As I said to our council a little later, I said, you show me anywhere else in Australia where within the space of 12 months we've got that sort of response from the community to a church-initiated function. And I said, why? Because we're actually addressing something that is relevant and meets needs. So that's exploded. And then of course, you can get doctors in to talk about men's health and prostate cancer and get your checkups and what have you. Then we had a minister who had been burnt out and left the church. He came back and said, look, I just love working with men. So he found a new lease in life, befriending men and what have you. Depression is a big thing, a hidden thing. So We had work going on with working in those areas, and then we didn't set out to do it. But the 3 local churches in the area, all the numbers have gone up because there's a connection. There's some people used to go to the church, and now there's some relevant stuff. Yeah, because the ministers would go and connect into the shed and do stuff and what have you, and away you go. The strategic. So we've got 24 of those now operating. Some, whatever it is, 5 years later, all generating new initiatives in communities, and that's why we've seen the growth. Because of time, just some quick stats to indicate the number of local churches, or CAPS. We coined this language. We're trying to emphasise the second story, and so instead of talking about churches and care services, we talked about kingdom access places, kingdom access points, which is a bit jargonish, I think, but it seemed to work in our system. It was, have we got places where people could access all of that the kingdom of God has to offer? And the kingdom of God is referred to hundreds of times through the scriptures. The kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. And the kingdom of God is a place where people feel safe, where they feel loved, where they can access, access basic services. They can access what they need to be to who God created them to be. There's a lot more I can say about that. But we've got 137 of those by our definition. Number of people regularly attending those, as you can see, the indicators there. Some of the other stats, we've had growth across all areas. So foster and kinship carers, so we do have a lot of foster places. You can see there, housing place, independent living. And as at last year, our AGM, there numbers of people that we are caring for, connecting with. So we've got uplift in our, people engaging through our classic church, theological, religious frameworks, but we also got uplift through all of our caring services, which we're trying to integrate, and we're on the journey. The goal is that every single one of those would be a kingdom access place, and yeah. So I just want to summarise and close, because I know Kerry's wanting me to finish, but three. I need to keep the time, of course. Sorry, Kerry, I expressed that the wrong way. I need to finish. Three key points that, and as I said, I could talk much more, but I believe that the future of the church, indeed I do believe this applies to any organisation, but certainly for the church, the need for integration of faith and works. We have since, it's been, if you plot it since the 60s, 70s, all the major denominations split off all of their care and all of their education arms. And they did that for insurance reasons and protection reasons and protecting the assets of the church. There was a whole host of reasons. They've paid a very, very heavy price for that. And I've said this in a number of forums. And certainly what we have done, and I'm only saying it because of what we have done, I've been asked to speak in many of the other denomination forums about my passion is that we need to bring these things back together, because the church birthed, if you go back in history, they birthed the health system, they birthed the education system, then the public sector picked it up, and I think that's absolutely right. But if the church is to go forward, what the population is, I can show you a lot more stats. People are still receptive to the church, but it's got to be around the areas of compassion and of actually meeting needs. They're not interested in is on Sunday morning going into a closed room and singing old songs. Now I'm being trivialising it, but 8% of the population is still interested in that, and that's great. But frankly, they're probably our age upwards. If you look at the stats, the ageing of the church is vastly worse than the ageing of the Australian population. So it will die out. We need to bring them forward. Very quickly, I put that up. I was in the UK last year, and this was a church, and I couldn't help it, but I saw this big sign at the front, new organ. And I said, Jeanette is my wife, I stopped in the street and I said, I've got to take a photo of that. I said, you reckon that'll do it? That it's going to get them all back in. It was just like, what? I know nothing about that church. It was just a church in the street. But they're putting up, that's their big sign, the new organ. And it's like, what is the predictable future of that? Yeah. And I might be being really unfair because I know nothing about the church at all. But it's just, you get trapped into this thing of connect with the community, connect with the people. The movement of Christianity was around people. and it was around love. So I'll skip over that because of time, but the second point was successful change starts with changing the story, the meta-narrative, or the way the world occurs to people. I think that's massively important we have it as individuals, our families, our, everywhere. The way the world occurs to us is how we behave, how we feel, and how we go forward. And I've said this in the church context, it doesn't matter if you've got 6 people, but if the story that they're operating in is that we are 6 people building to make a difference and we really want to impact this neighbourhood, watch what happens. But if it's 6 people that we're dying and we're just got to cling on here, well, watch what happens. What's the predictable future? I was going to say on that, just a couple of quick things. If you think about, I couldn't help but notice when Malcolm Turnbull, his first speech, when he took over on the Parliament grounds, what he did was immediately started to try and change the narrative, because he shifted the story from fear, because there was largely, I've got to say, I think Australia was being dominated by fear, fear of finances all going down the gurgler, fear of, we're going to have all the refugees, wave in. I think there was a lot of fear. Malcolm Turnbull, I'm not, again, sort of being part political, but I think he is a very good leader, and he is attempting to try and change the narrative about who are we as Australia and what have we got before us. It's on a much bigger scale, exactly what we try to do with Churches of Christ, of saying, because both stories are true. You'll find evidence to gather to support whatever story you want to live in. And we do it as individuals, we do it as families, we do it as nations. So I think, and organisations, I think leadership needs to, if you like, chart and create which story. And I'm not talking about making it up. It's actually, we can gather evidence for different stories. And the third one is that successful organisational change requires grassroots belief in, engagement with, and involvement in strategies and actions that will forward the mission in their local context. There's lots of textbook stuff that would say exactly the same as that. You must have a vision, you must have a mission, you must get people engaged. It's all true. But I want to emphasise that saying it's all true is actually, there's kilometres of depth to it. In our case, it was getting all of the major stakeholders to actually emotionally engage with the fact that we actually want to make a difference in communities, to this child, to this family, to this homeless person, to this community, to the state of Queensland. That's what we actually exist for. So we don't exist to grow our aged care services or to plant more churches. I find it fascinating, particularly in any of the forums. I'll ask some of our church leaders in the past, why do we want to plant more churches? And you're met with silence, because it's like, well, that's heresy to even question. Well, of course we want to plant more churches. And you say, well, why? To what end? What's it going to do? And you find them struggling. It's almost like, well, that's become such the power of thing. That's, we must plant more churches. And it exists across all denominations. But it's pushing it to say, to do what? To do what? What does it look like to be the people of God in communities? What would be the structures of that? What would be the forms of that? What would we see being different as a result of Christianity actually once more being forwarded in a contemporary relevant way? I'll finish.